From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Some have lost whole roofs. Some properties have been totally demolished. It is absolutely heart-wrenching. I mean, the infrastructure, the utilities infrastructure was damaged. The physical infrastructure was damaged.
Hurricane Irma, the most powerful storm ever recorded over the Atlantic Ocean, has left at least 10 dead in the Caribbean, more than 1 million without power in Puerto Rico, and the entire island of Barbuda virtually uninhabitable. It's now barreling toward the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and then Florida. Meanwhile, much of the Pacific Northwest is on fire, and the death toll from Hurricane Harvey has risen to 70. While President Trump speaks in North Dakota, celebrating his decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord and green light the Dakota Access and Keystone XL pipelines.
In order to protect American industry and workers, we withdrew the United States from the job-killing Paris Climate Accord. Job killer. People have no idea. Many people have no idea how bad that was. And right here in North Dakota, the Dakota Access Pipeline is finally open for business.
We'll speak with Free50.org co-founder Bill McKibben about the killer hurricanes and climate change. Then, as tensions continue to escalate between North Korea and the United States, we'll go to South Korea, where hundreds are protesting the deployment of THAAD missiles and the militarization of the Korean peninsula. Finally, is Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi presiding over a genocide against Rohingya Muslims in Burma?
They burned our houses. We could not take our belongings. We were hiding near a hill for 2 days. We were there in the rain without food and with my children. When we heard the sound of shooting, we took a boat and crossed the sea to come here to Bangladesh.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In the Caribbean, at least 10 people are dead after Hurricane Irma, the largest Atlantic hurricane on record, brought devastation to small islands as it barreled towards the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, and South Florida. The eye of the Category 5 storm struck the islands of St. Martin and Anguilla Wednesday with sustained winds of 185 miles an hour, leveling more than 90% of all structures. On Barbuda, the Prime Minister declared the island practically uninhabitable and warned the entire population may need to be evacuated as another storm, Hurricane Jose, could strike over the weekend. In Puerto Rico, more than 1 million people have lost power, as authorities warn some areas could be dark for up to 6 months, partly because the island's electrical infrastructure has gone neglected due to Puerto Rico's debt crisis. In Haiti, hundreds of residents at a tent city in the capital city, Port-au-Prince, who were left homeless after the 2010 earthquake, appealed to the government for shelter from the approaching storm.
I have no place to go. I have to stay here. I will live or die depending on how this storm hits us. If God wants to help us, He will, but we have no place to go.
In Florida, more than 100,000 people have been told to evacuate their homes as some computer models predict Hurricane Irma could make a direct hit on Miami as a Category 4 storm. Climate scientists say warmer ocean temperatures due to climate change likely adds to Hurricane Irma's power. We'll have more on Hurricane Irma and climate change after headlines as we speak with climate activist Bill McKibben. In Texas, family members of prisoners in the flood-ravaged city of Beaumont say their loved ones were left for days in flooded cells with inadequate food, water, and medical care after prison officials failed to evacuate them ahead of Hurricane Harvey. According to at least 7 relatives of prisoners at the Beaumont Federal Correctional Complex, some cells filled with water calf-deep, temperatures spiked to nearly 100 degrees as air conditioners failed, and prisoners wrapped towels over their noses to avoid the stench of sewage from backed-up toilets. In Washington, D.C., the House of Representatives voted 419-3 Wednesday to provide nearly $8 billion in initial emergency aid for relief and rebuilding from Hurricane Harvey as Texas struggles to recover from what's set to become the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history. The relief bill is on track to go to President Trump for his signature by Friday, just ahead of Hurricane Irma's expected landfall in South Florida. President Trump traveled to North Dakota Wednesday to pitch a tax plan that would overwhelmingly favor the wealthiest Americans while touting his administration's role in slashing environmental protections and promoting the fossil fuel industry. Trump made the remarks at an oil refinery in Mandan across from the Missouri River from the state capital, Bismarck.
In order to protect American industry and workers, we withdrew the United States from the job-killing Paris Climate Accord. Job killer. People have no idea. Many people have no idea how bad that was. And right here in North Dakota, the Dakota Access Pipeline is finally open for business.
President Trump also touted his move to reauthorize the Keystone XL pipeline, which would carry more than 800,000 barrels of tar sands oil per day from Alberta, Canada, to U.S. refineries. President Trump struck a 3-month deal Wednesday with congressional Democrats to raise the ceiling on the national debt, postponing a looming fiscal crisis and shocking members of Trump's own party, including his own White House aides. The deal left Republicans fuming, including Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, who last month questioned Trump's competence and stability. The agreement sets up a showdown on the federal borrowing limit in December. 15 states and the District of Columbia sued the federal government Wednesday by seeking to block President Trump's plan to end DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which gives nearly 800,000 young immigrants permission to live and work in the United States. Among those pressing the suit is New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman.
We understand what's going on in Washington, and we know that when bullies step up, you have to step to them and step to them quickly, and that's what we're here to do today. By definition, dreamers play by the rules. Dreamers work hard. Dreamers pay taxes. For most, America is the only home they've ever known. They deserve to stay here.
Trump's cancellation of DACA, which was announced Tuesday by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, set off mass protests in cities around the country. In Washington, D.C. Wednesday, activists outside the Department of Justice building toppled a Confederate monument-style effigy of Jeff Sessions perched atop a cardboard pedestal labeled Living Monument of White Supremacy. In South Korea, hundreds of protesters clashed with police in Seongju County Wednesday over the deployment of launchers for a U.S.-built missile defense system known as THAAD. Dozens of protesters were injured at the overnight standoff when police attempted to disassemble protesters' campsites and forcibly remove road blockades. The protests came as South Korea's government said it expects the North to test launch another intercontinental ballistic missile Saturday. We'll cover the escalating tensions between the U.S. and North Korea later in the broadcast. In Afghanistan, a suicide bomber detonated a checkpoint near Bagram airfield Wednesday, injuring 6 civilians. The Taliban claimed responsibility for the attack, calling it retaliation for an incendiary leaflet distributed by the U.S. military, featuring a verse from the Quran superimposed over the image of a dog. Meanwhile, the New York Times reports at least 18 CIA operatives have been killed in Afghanistan, a previously undisclosed number of deaths that rivals the number killed during the Vietnam War. Among the dead are Brian Ray Hoke and Nathaniel Patrick Delamar, who served as part of the CIA's paramilitary arm, the Special Activities Division. Bangladesh's government said Wednesday the Burmese military has begun planting landmines in the path of thousands of refugees fleeing a brutal crackdown by Burmese authorities, which UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has said could spiral into an ethnic cleansing campaign. CNN published photos showing an activist holding what appears to be a pair of anti-personnel landmines, and refugees reported one Rohingya boy had a leg blown off Tuesday after a mine exploded near a border crossing. Aid agencies say more than 120,000 Rohingyas have fled into neighboring Bangladesh in recent days. This is Dunya Khan, spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Some reported that their family members were burnt or shot or slashed to death. During their flight, many fled into the jungles or mountains. hiding and walking for days before they reach land or river and to cross the border. And some of them also told us that they've been walking for 3 days and they didn't have anything to eat. So other than the rainwater or the water on grounds.
In Mexico, 29-year-old journalist Juan Carlos Hernandez-Rios was shot dead Tuesday night after he left his home in the state of Guanajuato. Witnesses say he was killed by 2 men dressed in black carrying large-caliber weapons. Hernandez worked as an editorial assistant and photographer for the website La Bandera Noticias, which has received multiple threats in recent months over its news coverage. Hernandez-Rios is at least the 10th journalist killed this year in Mexico. On Capitol Hill, representatives of Facebook told lawmakers Wednesday the company unwittingly sold $100,000 worth of advertisements to a Russian company that aimed to polarize the U.S. electorate on issues of gun rights, immigration, LGBTQ rights, and racism. The company was described as a Russian troll farm with a history of pushing pro-Kremlin propaganda. Democratic Congressmember Adam Schiff cited the move as evidence Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Meanwhile, Donald Trump Jr. is set to testify privately today with congressional investigators as the Senate Judiciary Committee probes a meeting that the president's eldest son arranged in 2016 with a Russian lawyer promising damaging information about Hillary Clinton. The closed-door session comes after special counsel Robert Mueller urged Congress to schedule witness testimony in public session only to avoid the possibility that his investigators could be blocked from accessing information given to the committees privately. In Kentucky, a federal judge heard arguments Wednesday in a suit by Planned Parenthood and a women's health clinic in Louisville, challenging a law that would shutter the state's last remaining abortion clinic. Lawyers say the state's requirement that abortion providers have transfer agreements with a hospital and an ambulance service is a thinly veiled attempt to cut off abortion access. Last year, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a similar law in Texas. In New York City, a Bronx prosecutor dropped charges against Pedro Hernandez Wednesday after the 18-year-old was imprisoned for more than a year in the notorious Rikers Island jail awaiting trial for a crime he says he did not commit. Hernandez's plight has drawn comparisons to the case of Khalif Browder, another Bronx teenager who committed suicide at the age of 22 after being held at Rikers for nearly 3 years without trial for a crime he says he did not commit. And Seattle Seahawks star Michael Bennett said Wednesday police officers assaulted him and threatened his life outside a boxing match in Las Vegas last month as they arrested him while he joined a crowd of people fleeing the sound of gunshots. In a statement posted on Twitter, Bennett wrote that an officer threatened to, quote, blow my effing head off, and that, quote, Las Vegas police officers singled me out and pointed their guns at me for doing nothing more than simply being a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, unquote. Bennett has joined a protest movement led by former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick against racial injustice, sitting on the sidelines during the playing of the national anthem ahead of Seahawks games. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nareen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In the Caribbean, at least 10 people have died as the historic Category 5 Hurricane Irma barrels across the Atlantic Ocean and towards the U.S. coast. Hurricane Irma is the most powerful storm ever recorded over the Atlantic Ocean. On Wednesday, 8 people died on the island of St. Martin, 1 person died on Anguilla, and a 2-year-old child died on Barbuda. Barbuda and St. Martin were devastated by the 185-mile-an-hour winds. On Barbuda, 90% of all structures were destroyed. The Prime Minister, Gaston Brown, has declared Barbuda is practically uninhabitable and warns the entire island may need to be evacuated as another storm approaches.
You know that we are threatened now potentially by yet another storm, Hurricane Jose. And if that is the case and it's coming our way, then clearly we will have to evacuate the residents of Barbuda.
In Puerto Rico, more than 1 million people have lost power as authorities warn some areas could be without electricity for up to 6 months, partly because the island's electrical infrastructure has gone neglected due to Puerto Rico's debt crisis. The death toll from Hurricane Irma is expected to rise in the coming days as the storm moves toward the Dominican Republic and Haiti, then on to the U.S. southern coast in Florida. More than 100,000 people have been told to evacuate their homes in Miami-Dade County, as Irma is predicted to be one of the worst storms to ever hit Miami.
All this comes as the Trump administration and the state of Florida continues to deny the existence of climate change. In 2015, Florida Governor Rick Scott banned agencies from using the term climate change. On Wednesday, President Trump traveled to Mandan, North Dakota, and celebrated his decision to pull out of the landmark 2015 climate deal while speaking outside an oil refinery.
In order to protect American industry and workers, we withdrew the United States from the job-killing Paris Climate Accord. Job killer. People have no idea. Many people have no idea how bad that was. And right here in North Dakota, the Dakota Access Pipeline is finally open for business. I also did Keystone. You know about Keystone. Another one, big one, big. First couple of days in office, those two. 48,000 jobs, tremendous, tremendous thing. I think environmentally better. I really believe that, environmentally better.
President Trump was speaking in Mandan, the North Dakota town where hundreds of Native Americans and their allies have been jailed and strip-searched during the months-long resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline. All this comes as Houston, the fourth largest city in the country, is beginning to rebuild from Hurricane Harvey, one of the most powerful hurricanes in U.S. history. The death toll has now risen to 70 people. And while Houston, the petro-metro, was underwater, wide swaths of the Pacific Northwest continue to be on fire as uncontrollable wildfires burn hundreds of thousands of acres across Oregon, Montana, and Washington state. Well over 1,000 more people have died in historic flooding in South Asia, as well as parts of Africa in recent weeks. A third of Bangladesh is underwater. For more on climate change, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Harvey, and the extreme weather sweeping the globe, we're joined by Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, from his home in Vermont, author of a number of books, including Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet. Bill, welcome back to Democracy Now! As Irma is barreling through the Caribbean, and at least 10 people have been killed, as Houston is digging out from being underwater, President Trump was in Mandan, North Dakota, celebrating that he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord and green-lighted the Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone XL. Your response?
Well, I was interested to hear President Trump saying people had no idea how bad it was, the Paris Climate Accord. I have a feeling that's a phrase that a lot of Houstonians have been using in the last week, and a lot of people in the Caribbean today, and that people will be saying up and down the southeast coast of the United States and over in Washington and Oregon. People who aren't in the middle of these disasters have no idea how bad they are. In fact, really, Americans can't have any idea how bad they are because we've never had anything quite like them. I mean, Harvey in Houston, which we're on the edge of forgetting about as Irma pulls into the southeast, Harvey was the largest rainstorm event in U.S. history. 58 inches of rain in some places. That's the kind of storm that's only possible now that we've remarkably affected the climate.
Bill McKibben, can you also talk about, last week saw virtually unprecedented floods across South Asia as Bangladesh is 1/3 submerged underwater. Talk about how this has affected, these kinds of events have affected South Asia, other parts of the developing world, and small island developing states.
Look, the way that water moves around the planet is now dramatically different. And the places that are going to feel it most often and worst and hardest are the poorest and most vulnerable places on the planet, a list that begins with Bangladesh and with the low-lying island states. If you want one physical fact to understand the century we're now in, it's that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. And so we have the possibility for storms that are of a different magnitude and scale than we have seen before. The extra warmth in the atmosphere does all kinds of other things too. So right now in the high plains of the U.S., in North Dakota and Montana, in the biggest wheat-growing belt of the country, we've got what the scientists are describing as a flash drought. It's been so hot and so arid that in the course of a month or two, without rain and with that heavy evaporation, farm fields have just dried up. Many farmers have nothing to harvest. That's what's helping trigger these ridiculous spate of wildfires across the western United States. The fire is so big yesterday that it managed to jump the Columbia River from Oregon into Washington. People in Oregon and Washington are reporting ash fall from the forest fires on a scale comparable to that what happened when Mount St. Helens erupted. California had last week the largest wildfire in Los Angeles history, which really isn't a big surprise because it's been the hottest year in California history. So from
Bill,
Nepal,
we're going to break and come back to this discussion. Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, speaking to us from Vermont as we talk about extreme weather events from South Asia, where more than 1,200 people have died, to the fires of the Northwest, to the hurricanes Irma and Harvey. Jose not far behind. Stay with us. Acoustic guitar cover by Pauxi, a Burmese musician. We will later be talking about whether a genocide is being committed against the Rohingya by the Burmese military. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we continue our conversation with 350.org co-founder Bill McKibben. Let's turn back to President Trump, speaking in Mandan, North Dakota on Wednesday.
I want to take a moment to send our thoughts and prayers to the people of Texas and Louisiana who have truly suffered through a catastrophic hurricane. One of the worst hurricanes in our country's history, and guess what? We have another one coming. The one's coming now, Irma, they're saying is the largest one in recorded history in the Atlantic Ocean, coming out of the Atlantic, which gets big ones. I also want to tell the people of North Dakota and the western states who are feeling the pain of the devastating drought that we are with you 100%. 100%. I just said to the governor, I didn't know you had droughts this far north. Guess what? You have them. But we're working hard on it, and it'll disappear. It'll all go away.
That was President Trump speaking in Mandan, North Dakota, as he also talked about pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and green lighting the Dakota Access Pipeline, as well as the Keystone XL. Bill McKibben, Houston, the Petro Metro, home to so many of U.S. oil refineries, some of the largest in the country, like the ExxonMobil facility in Baytown, the second largest refinery in the country. The effects of the pollution there now, the EPA providing waivers during the hurricane for these refineries as they close down to emit even more toxins than they already do, and the people living on the fence line of these refineries, so often poor communities of color. Can you talk about the disparate effects? Well, everyone talks about, these hurricanes affecting everyone, rich and poor, equally. In fact, it is not the case ultimately who is most affected. And with the $8 billion now that Congress has just approved to start to help to deal with the recovery in Houston, the question is, where will that money go? Who will be helped in rebuilding? Will this money be going to refineries? And what does the whole fossil fuel industry have to do with the kind of severe weather we're experiencing now around the world?
Well, so first of all, as usual, poorest people and most vulnerable people get hit first. Frontline communities in South Texas are a perfect example. Places like Port Arthur that were just absolutely trashed by Harvey are difficult places to live in at best, in the best of times, because of the incredible daily pollution that comes from the fossil fuel industry. What makes Houston so interesting, as you point out, is that it's sort of the nerve center of the world hydrocarbon industry. It means that, and I think this is unlikely, but it means that if Houstonians really received a wake-up call from Harvey, more than most places in the world, their rebuilding could help the whole planet. If they seized the moment to say, we're going to start getting off oil and we're going to start reorienting our industries toward renewable energy, it would make a huge difference. And it's not an impossible idea. Last week, while all this was going on, Denmark announced that it had sold off its last remaining oil company and was going to use the cash to build more wind turbines. They're looking where the future is going. We, of course, are looking backwards, and no better example of that than Trump in North Dakota. The obscene party about the Dakota Access Pipeline, as archaic and dangerous a piece of technology as we've seen in this nation in a long time, coupled with his absurd promise that he's going to make the drought disappear in North Dakota. Look, the unreason that stems straight from the fossil fuel industry and its inability to deal with the fact that its business model has to change, that's what's at the bottom of an enormous amount of what we see around us right now.
And finally, where the climate movement is now, speaking out and connecting these issues, like your group, 350.org.
So the two important, I think we're basically in an end game now. And the two points that we're trying to make, and we'll make over and over and over again all over the world with increasing success in most places except the United States, are, one, we're going to have it all in terms of renewable energy. We have to go to 100% renewable energy, and we have to do it fast. That's why Senator Sanders has introduced that bill at a national level, along with Senator Merkley. That's why dozens of cities, from Atlanta to Salt Lake to San Diego, have adopted 100% renewable policies. Along with that all, you also have to say nothing. We have to say there'll be no more fossil fuel infrastructure development. And that's why we're fighting so hard every single pipeline, every single new coal mine. For the moment, of course, Trump is ascendant with the fossil fuel industry. They're getting their wishes in this country. But like many things that Trump touches, I think that this is a last gasp. People will come to associate, are coming to associate the insanity of going full speed ahead into this greenhouse future with the most reckless and crazy president that we've ever had.
Bill McKibben, I want to thank you for being with us, co-founder of 350.org, a number of his books out, including the last one, Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shea.
We turn now to the escalating tensions on the Korean peninsula and between the U.S. and North Korea. On Wednesday, South Korea said it expects North Korea to test launch another intercontinental ballistic missile on Saturday. The expected test comes after North Korea carried out its strongest ever nuclear test on Sunday. The underground nuclear blast was many times more powerful than the bomb the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, which killed 75,000 people.
The North's nuclear test came as U.S. and South Korea wrapped up their massive joint military drills on the Korean peninsula. North Korea has long objected to the annual drills, which include tens of thousands of troops. On Wednesday, a reporter asked President Trump if military action against North Korea is on the table.
We're going to see what happens. We'll see what happens. Certainly that's not a first choice, but we will see what happens. Thank you very much.
President Trump has also threatened to cut off trade with any countries that do business with North Korea. Experts say this proposal is next to impossible, since seizing trade with China, Brazil, Germany, Mexico, and other countries would be an economic catastrophe for the U.S. Trump has also escalated tensions with the U.S.'s longtime ally, South Korea, for being open to initiating peace talks with the North. Trump has threatened to cancel a trade agreement between the two countries.
That's between the United States and South Korea. Meanwhile, hundreds of protesters clashed with police in South Korea's Seongju County Wednesday over the deployment of more THAAD missile launchers. Dozens of protesters were injured at the overnight standoff when police attempted to disassemble protesters' campsites and forcibly remove roadblocks. For more, we're joined by two guests. Sun Lim joins us from Democracy Now! Video Stream, Director of International and Korean Peninsula Affairs, KCTU, Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union. Lim just came from protesting at the THAAD deployment site in South Korea. And in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Tim Shurock, investigative journalist, author of Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Outsourced Intelligence. He grew up in Tokyo and Seoul, has been writing about the U.S. role in Korea since the late 70s, correspondent for The Nation and the Korea Center for Investigative Journalism in Seoul. His new piece for The Nation, Diplomacy with North Korea, has worked before and can work again. Tim Shurock, let's begin with you. Talk about the latest deployment. Not clear if North Korea tested a hydrogen bomb. They say they did. A number of experts say that it couldn't be. And then are going to once again test an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, this weekend. Is the U.S. and Korea, North Korea, on a collision course? And what do you think needs to happen?
Well, they're definitely on a collision course, yes. And this has been going on for quite some time now. You know, at the beginning of this year, 2017, Kim Jong-un declared in his January 1 speech that he wanted the country to be ready with a nuclear weapon that could be put on an ICBM by the end of the year. So these tests and this latest nuclear test do not come as much of a surprise, really. But what's been really dangerous has been this escalation of this war of words between the U.S. and North Korea, and these threats, especially by Trump and Secretary of Defense Mattis, to destroy North Korea, to annihilate North Korea. These are very dangerous kinds of words to be using, and I think it's really raised the tensions to a point where there's got to be some kind of intervention, hopefully by some other country that can get this situation off of this, moving toward war and moving toward some kind of peace talks and negotiations.
Well, you said, Tim Shurock, that a third country should intervene. Now, what country would have the trust of both the U.S. and North Korea?
Well, Trump's been trying to rely on the Chinese to pressure North Korea, and I think there may be a possibility when the new U.S. sanctions come up in the UN Security Council, where China and Russia both, of course, have veto power, for the Chinese or the Russians to come in and say, they may support additional sanctions, but they will also push for some kind of peace negotiation, some kind of talk between the U.S. and North Korea, a diplomatic solution rather than war. That's what I mean. But I also think that the South Korean government of Moon Jae-in, has said from the beginning since his election that South Korea should be taking the lead in this, and they've been really eclipsed, partly by the fault of the U.S. policy, but I think Moon Jae-in has allowed that to happen as well. And they, of course, it's their country. They have the right to negotiate with North Korea, despite the fact that Trump called Moon Jae-in's appeal to diplomacy appeasement. So I think this intervention could come from China or Russia, but I think South Korea has a very important role to play as well.
Can you talk, Tim Shurock, about what you believe the North Korean president wants? What is he attempting to accomplish?
Well, I think at the least he wants to signal the United States that he has the military power to strike back at not only the U.S. in South Korea, but U.S. assets and bases in Japan, Okinawa, and Guam. The last threat he made, the last specific threat he made, of course, was a few weeks ago when he said they would send some missiles toward Guam. Now, why Guam? Well, because Guam is the base for B-1B bombers that the U.S. would use to attack North Korea in case of a war. And there's been exercises even in the past few days where they've flown these B-1s from Guam into Korean skies. So I think at the least he's trying to show that the United States, that he has the military capability to fight a war, as he says, in the Pacific region. And he's trying to get some kind of, military positioning himself, possibly for future negotiations.
Well, meanwhile, the U.S. representative to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, has said that North Korea is begging for war. And as we said earlier, the test that North Korea carried out was the strongest it ever has. Now, barring the intervention of a third country, Tim Shurock, where do you see this going?
Well, I think the people that are begging for war is CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, for that matter. I see the networks pushing for war. That's what they're dreaming of, I think. And you see a lot of pro-war sentiment in the U.S. media as well, sentiment for regime change and this kind of thing. So I think it's a very dangerous situation. It's being heated up by a press that reports nonsense about North Korea and South Korea, for that matter. And Trump can take advantage of this. There's very little investigative reporting. For example, there's so much reporting about how large their missiles are and how far they can go, but very little attention on the mechanics of how a peace might work, how peace talks might proceed, what North Korea wants, what the U.S. wants, how that might work. That's what I tried to do in this article in The Nation, which was to show the history of the U.S.-North Korean negotiations and show that the agreement made in the 1990s by President Clinton and Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, froze North Korea's nuclear program. They didn't have a bomb then, but they had a nuclear program. They froze it for 12 years, and they agreed both to move toward diplomatic and full diplomatic and economic relations. And that agreement was, broken during the Bush administration by the United States, and North Korea cheated on it as well. But both sides broke it. So in the mass media in the United States, it's always that this agreement went through and then North Korea broke it the next day. That is not true. The agreement lasted for many years, and it finally ended when the Bush administration falsely accused the North Koreans of having a uranium program to the bomb and just tore up the agreement. And it was after that that they proceeded very rapidly to build their nuclear bomb, and they exploded their first nuclear bomb in 2006 under Bush. So, I think that talks can work, it's not exactly clear how Kim Jong-un would react because he's very young. He has not had any negotiations, but he is certainly surrounded by people. His foreign minister has negotiated with the United States for many years as his deputy foreign minister, and there's people in his government who have decades of experience in diplomacy and have talked to the United States. So I think, diplomacy really is the only way. You can't have sanctions and tough policies without negotiations. That makes the situation worse.
We want to bring in Wolsan Lim into this conversation. Just came from protesting at the THAAD deployment site in South Korea, protesting militarization of the peninsula. Wolsan Lim, explain where you are right now in South Korea, what the THAAD is, and what you're calling for. So many in South Korea feel like they're at ground zero.
Thank you for having me on the show, and it's good to be here with Tim Shorak as well. The situation in Korea is that since last year, the United States and the South Korean government authorities and military authorities have been moving to deploy and have gone through with the deployment of this THAAD missile defense system, which is a missile defense system that is supposed to be designed to shoot down missiles, including nuclear warheads, in the terminal phase, and so as they enter. And the argument behind that from the United States and the South Korean government is that this is being used as a deterrent or as protection against North Korean, the threat of North Korean nuclear weapons. But there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that these missile defense is actually, in particularly THAAD, is actually not effective against most missiles, and particularly not from North Korean missiles that would be targeted at South Korea at such a short range. And one of the main issues here is that this missile is actually, it's a weapon system, really, because it's part of a larger strategy for U.S. military buildup in the region. It's being deployed in a small village in the Seongju County, which is about three hours outside of Seoul, south of Seoul. And it's an area where it's a farming village. There's a lot of elderly people who live there, and they're very concerned about the impact of the radar on their farming and on their environment, on their health. But they also have recognized that this weapon system is actually exacerbating tensions between South Korea and North Korea, and then also with China, who feels very threatened by the fact that you can use the system, in fact, the radar that is part of the system, to monitor the entire Chinese airspace as well as North Korea. And so there's been quite a strong protest from the residents in that area, supported by peace activists from around the country, to stop the deployment. Unfortunately, the U.S. military and Korean government just moved through with deploying 4 more launchers to complete a THAAD unit there. So there's 6 launchers that are now stationed. And so it was a really passionate struggle, but one that, we weren't able, in fact, to block the equipment from being brought into the deployment site.
And Wolsan Lim, can you comment on the way that President Trump has been responding to this crisis with North Korea?
I definitely echo what Tim just said. I think it's incredibly dangerous, the war of words, the threat of preemptive strike, which Trump has preemptive nuclear strike, which Trump has referenced several times, or other, raining fire and fury down on North Korea. It clearly exacerbates the situation, and I think that because Trump is really unpredictable and does things that are not so calculated, sometimes it makes the situation even more dangerous. I wanted to mention that this is really, and I think that Tim also alluded to it, but this is really the crisis that we're experiencing now. While it's exacerbated by the Trump administration incredibly, it's also part of a product of a long-term history of the United States hostile policies towards North Korea, stemming back from the Cold War. And so North Korea's nuclear development, while I definitely don't want to justify it, it is the result of a sense of a threat that the United States will at some point use nuclear weapons or conventional weapons against it to try to achieve regime change. This is because the United States maintains a policy of preemptive strike against North Korea, and because of the war exercises that you mentioned conducted with South Korea every year that particularly target the target of the exercises is an attack on the North Korean leadership. And so because of that, this understandable sense, if you think about it, this understandable sense of threat, North Korea has felt that unless it wants to be another Iraq, it has to develop nuclear weapons in order to have some kind of defense against much greater power that is the United States. And what the North Korea ultimately wants is normalization of relations and a peace treaty to end the conflict on the Korean Peninsula. There was, at the end of the Korean War in 1953, there was an armistice signed, not a peace treaty. And so, in fact, there's still a state of war going on, and North Korea has been explicit that it wants a peace treaty and normalization of relations.
Well, Walson Lee, we want to thank you for being with us just back from protesting at the THAAD deployment site in South Korea, speaking to us from Seoul, and Tim Shurock joining us from Washington, D.C., investigative journalist. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we're going to look at what's happening in Burma, where more than 150,000 Rohingya of Muslim minority fleeing Burma into Bangladesh. Is there a genocide happening? Stay with us. Is It a Dream by Classics Nouveau here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show by looking at Burma. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has warned the brutal Burmese military operation against Rohingya Muslims is at risk of spiraling into an ethnic cleansing campaign as the violence against the long-persecuted minority group continues. The UN says almost 150,000 Rohingyas have fled the predominantly Buddhist country into neighboring Bangladesh in the last 12 days since the military operation began, with up to 15,000 more expected to flee every single day this week.
Advocates say as many as 800 Rohingya civilians, including women and children, have been killed in recent days. This is Rohingya Muslim Salma Begum, one of the tens of thousands who fled to Bangladesh following the army crackdown, which began last month.
They burned our houses. We could not take our belongings. We were hiding near a hill for 2 days. We were there in the rain without food and with my children. When we heard the sound of shooting, we took a boat and crossed the sea to come here to Bangladesh.
Burma's de facto leader and Nobel Peace Laureate Aung San Suu Kyi has blamed terrorists for what she termed, quote, a huge iceberg of misinformation about violence in the western part of the country. More than 300,000 people have signed a petition calling on the Nobel Committee to revoke her Peace Prize over her response to the violence. Meanwhile, accusations have emerged that Burmese security forces have been planting landmines along the Bangladesh border to prevent fleeing Rohingya from returning. Burmese officials said Wednesday they're lobbying powerful allies, China and Russia, to prevent a UN Security Council resolution on the issue.
Talk more about the issue. We are joined right now by two people to talk about both the Rohingya in Burma and those who have fled to Bangladesh. In London, Toon Khin, president of the Burmese Rohingya organization in the UK, born and brought up in Burma's Arakan state in 1982, rendered effectively stateless along with 1 million other ethnic Rohingya under a new nationality law. Here in New York, Richard Weir, fellow in the Asia division covering Burma at Human Rights Watch, based in Burma last year. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Toon Khin, what is happening to the Rohingya, to your people? Explain for a global audience who may have never even heard of of that word before, the Rohingya Muslim minority in Burma?
Rohingya people are native people of Arakan State. They're living in Arakan State early 7th century AD, according to the history. After we got independence from British 1948, Rohingya were recognized as an ethnic group of Burma. On that time, Rohingya parliamentary members and MPs are there. According to the history, Rohingya were living the early 7th century AD. The thing is, Burmese government systematic persecution started in 1962 when General Deng took power. So that what we are facing today is the last stage of genocide. Rohingya been stripped of their citizenship, stripped of their ethnic right. They were not allowed to move from one village to another. They are not allowed to get married. They can't go to higher education. That's what we've been facing many years in our kind of states. What's happening now is since 25th August, Burmese military launched attack when some Rohingya militant attacked some police posts. So by taking that excuse, Burmese military targeting the whole Rohingya population, according to our information we received from Arakan State, at least 30,000 Rohingya been killed, shot dead and slaughtered, and including elderly men, women and children. We are receiving information that many children been thrown to the fire. Burmese army continuously burning down Rohingya villages until today, and some sources are saying death toll could be more than 7,000, and thousands of Rohingya houses burned down. According to the information we receive, in 180,000 Rohingya IDPs, humanitarian crisis is growing in Arakan State. 30,000 Rohingya have been trapped in a mountain. There is no food, no shelter, no medicine for them. And it is very horrific situation we are facing in our history. That should not be happening in 21st century, where death toll is increasing and children are dying day by day. It's a quite I should say it's been going a last stage of genocide, where government is targeting the whole population to wipe out Rohingya minority from Burma.
Well, Human Rights Watch has published new satellite imagery that shows 700 buildings burned in the Muslim village of Chain Kharli in Rakhine State. The imagery shows that 99% of the village was destroyed. Now, we're also joined by Richard Weir, a fellow in the Asia division at Human Rights Watch. You were based in Burma last year. So, first of all, tell us what this satellite imagery showed.
Right, so this satellite imagery shows that a village primarily occupied by the Rohingya population is completely destroyed. So the damage that we're seeing is consistent with burn damage. And that's something that we've only been able to see one village out of 21 unique sites that we've identified where there have been active fires. And so this is just sort of a small window into the sort of destruction that's occurring in northern Rakhine State.
Well, what's happening now is reportedly unprecedented. I mean, despite the fact that the Rohingya minority has been targeted for decades, it's unprecedented in terms of the sheer violence and brutality that's been deployed by the Burmese security forces. Could you explain why this is happening now?
Well, as we've been discussing, the Rohingya population has been discriminated against and attacked on various occasions throughout many decades. And this series of attacks follows another set of attacks in October 2016, where very similar violence was documented by Human Rights Watch, by other organizations, including the UN, which said those violations very likely amounted to crimes against humanity. And those attacks and the scope and the scale of the destruction wrought was less than what we're seeing right now. We haven't seen this number of villages on fire, and this is something that we just haven't seen before.
I want to go to the role of the Nobel Peace Laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, who was imprisoned for like 15 years. She has faced widespread criticism for her response to the crisis. She's considered sort of the de facto leader of the Burmese now, working closely with the Burmese military. She initially blamed, quote, terrorists for what she termed, quote, a huge iceberg of misinformation about violence in Western Burma. Earlier today, she said her government is doing its best to protect everyone in the strife-torn state of Rakhine, but she did not refer specifically to the exodus of the Rohingya in recent weeks.
We have to take care of our citizens. We have to take care of everybody who is in our country, whether or not they are our citizens. It is our duty, and we try our best. Of course, our resources are not as complete and adequate as we would like them to be, but still we try our best, and we want to make sure that everyone is entitled to the protection of the law.
So that's Aung San Suu Kyi, Richard Weir. What is her role here?
Well, her role is she's the de facto leader of the government. And she's not only that, but she is the leader of the people. And as a former lauded human rights advocate, she needs to do more, not just as an advocate, but as the leader of a government that requires the protection of all the people in the states. And frankly, her comment that they're doing all that they can is not borne out in our research. What we're hearing from people that have fled to Bangladesh is that the military is firing on villagers, is using bombs to attack them. It's just not what she's saying has not been borne out by our research.
More
and people
than
aren't being protected.
300,000 people have signed a petition calling on the Nobel Committee to revoke her Peace Prize. How responsible is she? I mean, she is not the official leader of Burma yet, but of course considered the de facto leader. A person who's been jailed by the military for so many years, now working closely with the Burmese military.
Well, the problem is that in the Burmese constitution, the 2008 constitution, there is a divide between who controls what in the government. And the Senior General Min Aung Hlaing controls the military, he controls the police, he controls the border guards. So Aung San Suu Kyi doesn't have direct control over the forces that we've documented have engaged in these abuses, but she does have a responsibility to do everything that she can to call out these abuses, to force an end to what's going on.
Well, Tun Kin, I want to turn very quickly to the 1982 citizenship law with which you were effectively stripped you became stateless. And even today, Rohingya are not granted Burmese citizenship. Could you tell us very quickly what the implications of that are?
Actually, 1982 citizenship law deprived basic fundamental rights of Rohingya. Because of that law, today 1.3 million Rohingya become stateless in their own state. Because of that law, even myself, I'm not a citizen of Burma, even though my grandfather was a parliamentary secretary. That law designed for Rohingyas and other minorities in Burma. Particularly, they are practicing for the Rohingya Muslims. So because we don't have national scrutiny card after introducing that law, so we can't go to university, we can't get married, we can't move from one village to another. That is what they are practicing. So the point here is, I point here out what we are facing today is decades of persecution going on against Rohingya. Right now, mass killings going on. Is a genocide where direct killings involved by Burmese army. We need urgent UN intervention to send UN peacekeeping force to Arakan state to save the lives of Rohingya before too late, where death toll is increasing. So we are a people 1.3 million in Arakan state begging, appealing international community to come and save us. That's what people have been telling from the ground. You know, day by day, death toll is increasing and continuously.
We're going to have to leave it there. We thank you so much for being with us, President of the Burmese Rohingya Association in London, and thank you so much to Richard Weir. That does it for our show. Tonight in New York, Juan Gonzalez will be unveiling his book at the New School. We hope everyone will come at 7 o'clock. Check our website. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.